Okay, hi everybody. So, as you'll recall, we went pretty slowly through Vasubandhu, and as a result, we did not get to the material that we were hoping to discuss today. But that's okay. I'm just going to record my discussion of it now, and then I will upload this video along with the Buddhist epistemology discussion on Tuesday. So, in order to understand Chandrakirti's critique of Yogācāra, we should review how it is that Yogācāra and Madhyamika can be said to be two members of the same genus. Namely, they're both Mahayana philosophies that endorse the view that all phenomena are empty in some way. Now, the main disagreement here is that the Yogācāra philosophers are going to claim of the Madhyamika that they've gone a little bit too far in their discussion of emptiness, and the Yogācāra is going to try and counterbalance the nihilistic tendencies in the Madhyamika by explaining how it is that phenomena that we perceive are empty in virtue of the projection powers of the mind. And the idea in the Yogācāra position, as we've seen, is that when such constructing processes are acknowledged, then one will affirm the existence, the ultimate intrinsic existence of a storehouse consciousness, which is responsible for the constructions. So the Madhyamika response to the Yogācāra will be that they have reified the mind into something unknowable and something that looks a lot like a Brahma or an Atman, and that we shouldn't go that way either. So to understand Chandrakirti's criticism, the first thing you need to recognize is we need to do a little bit of metaphysical bootstrapping. And what I mean by that is we need to think a bit about this view that I have here on your handout, on the bottom of the first page of your handout, called monism. Metaphysical monism, and we've discussed this a little bit in class, so hopefully this will be reviewed. Monism is the view that there's only one kind of thing in the world. And there are different kinds of monisms. I have here on your handout 3. The motivation behind monism is to try and simplify reality, to explain everything in terms of one fundamental kind of thing. So in our ordinary, everyday, conventional interactions with the world, it looks like there's a lot of different kinds of things. But really, if you analyze them all, you'll recognize that they're really just part of one deeper thing. So what might that thing be? One very popular view is called physicalism. And this is the view that everything is physical, including the mind. So the mind might seem to itself on introspection to not obviously be a physical thing, but according to physicalism, everything is physical, including the mind, and so the mind is probably going to be thought of as some kind of informational system in the brain. Another version of monism is idealism, the view that everything is mental in some way. And this is the Yogācāra position that we're going to continue to focus on, and the criticisms of that will come from Madhyamika, Chandrakirti's Madhyamika. And then finally, I'll just note that there's another species of monism that's sometimes called neutral monism, and this is the view that there's one kind of thing, but we don't really know what it is. We just know that physical properties and mental properties are aspects of it, but it is some underlying thing that is neither purely physical nor purely mental. Now, since Chandrakirti is a Madhyamika philosopher, he is going to reject all metaphysical views that claim to know the ultimate truth about phenomena. Now, in response to Yogācāra idealism, he's going to reject the kind of monism that is embedded in that view with his own peculiar brand of dualism. But Chandrakirti's dualism is not a Cartesian dualism. A lot of dualistic philosophies are metaphysical dualisms in that they claim that what is ultimately real is these two basic things, mind and matter. Chandrakirti's dualism is nothing like that. I'm going to read a quote from Sandy Huntington's commentary on the bit that he translated in your text. Huntington says, Chandrakirti's version of dualism does not embody a metaphysical position. Rather, it is grounded in an empirical appeal to our everyday experience, including the experience of thoughts and sensations that appear in the course of normal introspection. So he's going to affirm a kind of conventional dualism that says, look, the only thing we know about consciousness for sure is that it's tied up with a world of conventional objects. And if you think that there's some kind of consciousness that exists outside that framework of conventional reality, you have no basis on which to affirm its existence. Chandrakirti's first point against the Yogācāras is to say, look, you're over-interpreting the scripture. Okay? So he starts in verse 87 of your text by claiming that the scripture asserts that the triple world, that is the sensual world, the fine material world, and the immaterial world, those three worlds, the triple world, have 31 realms, and that's the totality of samsara. That the triple world is mind alone. In order to make the point that the mind alone is preeminent and to negate any other such preeminent factor. When the scripture says that mind alone exists, form does not, this is taught to deny the importance of form and so forth, not to negate their very existence. So the claim here is that the Madhyamika endorses the Yogācāra's attitude that the most important thing for us as Buddhist philosophers is the nature of the mind. He agrees. But he does not agree that singularity of focus entails a metaphysical thesis about the non-existence of form. So the other point that he's going to make, which is really interesting, it's an interesting argument, is that a non-dual, purely luminous mind being the end-all of all Buddhist soteriological practice, that such a claim can be denied on doctrinal grounds regarding the nature of dependent origination. And so in verse 88 with its commentary, Chandrakirti argues in the following way, and this is on the bottom of the second page of your handout. He claims first that consciousness arises in dependence on formations. And that's just a basic premise of the 12-point formulation of dependent origination. That sankharas or samskaras are the condition for the arising of vijnana. Then the second premise is, if consciousness arises in dependence on formations, then it cannot have any intrinsic distinguishing characteristic. For example, non-dual luminosity. Why? Why would a dependence relation on samskaras mean that consciousness cannot have a svabhava? Well, because for Madhyamika, dependent origination is such that what makes a thing what it is independence on something else. So it can't have any properties or aspects that properly individuate it, because the only way it can arise and be what it is by being dependent on something else. But if consciousness did have an intrinsic distinguishing characteristic, then it would not be dependent on formations, and therefore consciousness cannot have any intrinsic distinguishing characteristic. Yet, even though he thinks that consciousness doesn't have any intrinsic distinguishing characteristic, and in virtue of that, therefore, that it doesn't make sense to affirm of the storehouse consciousness that its only distinguishing characteristic is its luminous non-dual awareness, even though he rejects that, he then goes on to say, and this is a quote from verse 88, page 314 of your text, he says, Chandrakirti is yet happy to admit, along with, in agreement with the Yogācārans, that mind and no other is the preeminent cause of the creation of the universe. Why is that? Because of karma, and that's what we talked about today in class, and also last week when we discussed Vasubandhu, so I won't press the point further. The point that Chandrakirti is making here is that from within conventional truth, we have no grounds to deny the existence of form, of physical form. But from the point of view of ultimate truth, to assert the existence of the mind separate from form seems like a kind of metaphysical reification that divorces the arising of consciousness from its proper context and dependent origination. Let's consider some further verses. In 91, he says, within the context of everyday affairs, all 5 psychophysical constituents taken for granted in the world do exist. However, none of the 5 appears to a yogi who pursues illuminating knowledge of reality. Therefore, seeing as this is so, If form does not exist, then do not cling to the existence of the mind, and if the mind exists, then do not cling to the non-existence of the form. So let's break these verses down into a proper argument. It goes something like this. All five aggregates are conventionally real, including consciousness and form. So when we're looking at conventional reality, the five aggregates are real. They're conventionally real, and they help us have access to a world of objects, which is conventionally real. Premise 2 is when one is liberated, then none of these aggregates appears. Now, if one claims that ultimately consciousness exists without form, then one is denying the fact that consciousness exists in dependence on form and reifying consciousness into something that cannot be verified. But consciousness does exist in dependence on form, and reification on the non-verifiable should be avoided. Therefore, one should not claim that consciousness exists without form. Okay, so the point that's being made here is quite complicated, so let's go through it very carefully. Part of what's being claimed here, and I'm just reading from the bottom of the third page of your handout, part of what's being claimed here is that our understanding of what consciousness could be is tied up with conventional reality of subjectivity and objectivity. So what Chandrakirti is saying here is that what it means for consciousness to exist is to be already strapped into this subject-object duality. What it is to be consciousness is to be in contact with objects. What it is to be an object is to be available to the mind. Thus the notion of form or object and consciousness mutually define each other. And thus there's a big soteriological difference here, a difference in how they conceive of progress towards liberation. Namely, that the Yogācāra philosopher sees liberation in terms of achieving a kind of purified non-dual awareness. Whereas the Madhyamika thinks to conceive of liberation in terms of consciousness is to maintain hold on a concept that is best relinquished. Thus, the direct yogic experience of selflessness or emptiness of both consciousness and its contents, their lack of inherent existence, is itself liberation from the suffering caused by clinging to reified categories of subject and object. So, the way to think about this is to understand that the disagreement that is being had between these two camps is about what a coherent concept of consciousness is. The Yogācāra philosophers think that they have a clear concept of consciousness that can be experientially verified in liberation experiences of a consciousness that is luminous, glowing, does not have an object, and is purified of all defilements. It is completely disentangled from the world of subject and object, and is coextensive with liberation. Now, the disagreement on the other side now from Chandrakirti is actually quite subtle, because Chandrakirti is happy to admit that the mind is the most important factor, that is what needs to be liberated from suffering, and he also is happy to claim that in the final stages of enlightenment, there's this luminosity. What he's denying, is that it makes sense to characterize these sorts of liminal enlightenment experiences as being experiences of consciousness, because for him, the concept of consciousness is tied up with the aggregates, dependent origination, and the world of meaning in which the mind is enmeshed and ensnared because of all of its attachments. And so his point is that, look, what it is to be conscious is to have an object. And so if there's some enlightenment level experience where there is no object anymore and there is no subject, it doesn't make sense to think about that in terms of consciousness. It's something else. And we probably can't talk about what that is, because the very thresholds of our language are bounded by the horizon of conventional truth. And so we have to be mindful of how we speak about these notions in order to keep our minds steady. So one other thought that I'll leave you with is the question of whether or not the storehouse consciousness represents a kind of Buddhist equivalent of an Atman or a Brahman. And One reason you might think that the storehouse consciousness is a problematic kind of secret self that's been snuck in the back door is that the storehouse consciousness, unlike other ordinary forms of consciousness, does not exist independent on anything else. It is that which other moments of consciousness are dependent on. So, it's true that its activity is only meaningful in relation to other parts of the mind, that is the storehouse consciousness. But once it's been purified of its karmic seeds, its bija, it has no defining characteristic outside of, according to the Yogācārans. So on the one hand, it looks like an independent existence because it doesn't depend on anything, but then it doesn't have a positive defining characteristic. But that's also kind of problematic because, as we've seen, Vasubandhu in a number of places has characterized the storehouse consciousness when it's purified, when there's no more seeds left, as being equivalent to liberation, and the language of luminosity and purity is often used to characterize its existence. So perhaps the Madhyamika might argue then that the luminous bliss of emancipation, which is attributed to the purified storehouse consciousness, is such a characteristic. The issue is quite complex, and a lot of debate has happened around it, and I can't pursue that here, but I hope that these two objections, the objection that we have no concept of consciousness separate from its entanglement with a conventional world, on the one hand, and the idea that a notion of consciousness which is not so entangled, which is separate and independent and luminous and pure, that such a consciousness would then, if we can call it that, if we can even call it that, will be guilty of smuggling in a Brahman or an Atman back into this system, namely the idea that there's this really real substratum of mind that you become fully immersed in when you become liberated. And that looks, perhaps to some, certainly to the Madhyamika Buddhists, like a kind of anti-Buddhist position, and that's how they push back. Okay, that's it. See you in a week.